Welcome to my opening Facebook Live session. I apologize for the delay. We had a few technical difficulties as we attempted to get underway tonight, but I appreciate your patience as you've shared in this time. I don't know about you, with all of the changes around us, we're all being asked to stretch somewhat. I'm not particularly comfortable in front of cameras, believe it or not, and so here I am on Sundays and now on Wednesdays, trying to connect with you through the camera. And I hope you'll be patient with me in this process and allow this time to just be a personal time of encouragement and support. Now, I do have a few requests of you as we would get into tonight's session. As you're joining us for this opening time, in the comments below, if you would just say hello, it would be thrilling just to see those that are participating, those that are attending and taking part in this evening's time. So just say hello in the comments section. And also, if you've come into tonight's time with maybe some questions, we've been reading through the Psalms in the last little bit, and maybe you've already had a question or two that you would like us to try to address. You can submit the questions in the comments section too. And if I can't get to them tonight, I will try later on to respond to those questions in a way that hopefully will clarify some of the answers for you. And one other request I would make, if you've come tonight with some prayer requests, typically on Wednesday, we have a Bible study and a prayer time, and maybe this evening you have some prayer concerns that we can just lift to the Lord. You can submit those also in the comments sections. If they're more private in nature, you can perhaps share those with me in private messaging on Facebook or email me at northfortworth.com, Stephen Lowry at northfortworth.com. We'll try to share that with the ministry team, and we will be seeking to lift you up in prayer. I would, though, ask one other favor. If you have your phone nearby, as Easter is approaching, we're trying to find new ways to connect with you and to encourage you. And this is what you can do to help us with that. We're wanting to be able to send out some text notifications. And what that would involve is if you'll just take out your phone and text a message to 97000, and then in the message part, just type in NFWBC. Once again, that would be 97000, and then the message you send would be NFWBC. What that will allow us to do is in the coming weeks is to send you by text some reminders, some notifications in ways that we hope will be an encouragement to you along the way. Again, just all of that in an introductory way. As you arrive to our time tonight, say hello in the comments section below. I think my mom, all the way from Lubbock, is going to be trying to join us for our Facebook Live session. And so maybe you too are choosing to be a part of this evening. Of course, the purpose of tonight's session is for us to have a little bit of time of Bible study. About 10 days ago, I encouraged the church family to begin reading in the Psalms, but also in the book of Acts. Now, I wanted us to read in the book of Acts because in that history book of the early church, it describes how God was able to work through believers in Jesus in incredibly difficult circumstances. Now, none of us would have imagined we would be facing the circumstances we're facing, but if you read through the book of Acts, you can be confident that God can work in these circumstances too. So we're reading a chapter a day as we move through the book of Acts. But I also asked you to consider reading through the Psalms, a psalm a day. Now, why did I ask you to join us in that reading? Because at least from my own personal experience, over the last decade, the Psalms have been especially helpful to me. In a personal way, they've helped me better understand who I am. They've helped me discover in a deeper way who God is. They've also helped me come to appreciate the life of faith. There are lessons that one can discover through the book of Psalms that I don't know that you'll find in any other books of the Bible. And so I thought it would be helpful, it would be uplifting just to read a psalm a day and allow God to help move us forward through all that we're experiencing through the coronavirus. Now, why do I think the psalms themselves are so beneficial? Well, in part, because they're just so full of emotion. Frequently, as you read a psalm, you'll find a person confronted by circumstances beyond their control. Anybody identify with that? And yet, in the midst of the psalms, they express their emotions so honestly. It's such a broad range of emotions. Sometimes they'll describe how they're afraid. Other times they're angry. Other times they're confused. All of these jumbled emotions can be found in so many of the Psalms. And I don't know about you, in the midst of some of my difficulties, I struggle in knowing how to express my emotion to God, particularly when I'm disappointed. And through the Psalms, I've discovered that their words can become my words, that I can, through what they write, express my emotions to God. I would encourage you to allow that to also be true of you. Just let them, in a personal way, lift whatever you're feeling to God, knowing that He desires to hear our hearts. And be assured, the Psalms are in the Bible. God is the one who's inspired the various writers to express the emotions that they express. So we should be assured that God very much accepts that level of honesty as we would express it to God. And so I wanted us to have an outlet of our emotions as we would read through the Psalms. But to me, the Psalms are more than that. Sometimes the Psalms are like a cold water that I splash upon my heart or my mind or my soul to awaken my faith. Much of the Psalms point a person through the different emotions toward a renewal of faith and trust. And at least in my journey, there have been instances where I needed that splash of cold water. I needed to be awakened in ways that would allow my journey of faith to be more consistent, more personal. And in the Psalms, you're going to find that sometimes it will serve as a light in the midst of the darkness that surrounds you. And with all of the headlines and the news that we've been bombarded by, sometimes it may feel as if we're being surrounded by darkness. But the Psalms, if we read them day by day, can just be like a light that suddenly awakens our awareness to the presence of God and can move us in personal ways to experience God more personally, more directly. And so that's why 10 days ago, I encouraged you just to start reading a psalm a day, allowing the testimony of those various writers to become a way of expressing your emotion and your faith to God. And in the Wednesdays to come through the month of April and maybe, who knows, maybe into the month of May, I want us midweek just to pause, to reflect on some of what you've read, to give you an outlet to raise questions, or maybe in the comments, it's not so much a question that you have, but there's an insight that you've gained that you could share in a way that would encourage everyone that's participating tonight. The Psalms will be for us a friend, a companion to move us through the experiences that we face. With all of that as an introduction, let's consider in a brief way a couple of Psalms tonight that may be helpful to us. Beginning with the opening Psalm. 10 days ago, we read from Psalm 1, and you find in the opening Psalm actually, I think, an attempt on the part of the writer to position our heart so that everything else we would read in subsequent weeks or days and future Psalms would indeed strengthen us. It really is designed to kind of prepare the mind and heart to move toward God through the reading of His Word. So allow me just to, in a brief way this evening, just to walk you through some of the insights of Psalm 1. If you want to find your Bible so that you can look at it along with me, we can be encouraged together. Psalmist writes this: "Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. Now, I'm sure every single one of us want to experience the blessing of God. We want to be characterized as blessed. And yet, how do we encounter that? I mean, what do I do in the remainder of this week to experience more actively the blessing of God or the activity of God? Well, in these opening two verses, the psalmist is trying to point us in that direction. He says we're blessed not when we turn to those who are seeking to walk away from God for insight, but rather when we actively turn to God to discover the wisdom that we need in life. Verse 2 says you're blessed when one delights in the law or the instruction of the Lord. And not only delighting in it, but you live with it. You meditate on it day and night. Now, let me clarify. I don't think we're blessed as a result of simply reading the Bible or reading a psalm. We're blessed when, in essence, what we do is seek to relate to God through the Bible or through a psalm. Because you see, the favor or the goodness in life that all of us want to experience is derived as we discover a life in relationship with a God who loves us. And that's honestly what the psalmist is trying to point you to. I mean, don't turn toward those who are going to lead you away from God. You'll be disappointed there. Choose instead to move toward God through the revelation of his word, through his instruction, through his wisdom. And as you relate to him in that way, then you'll discover a favor, a goodness, a fullness that he supplies to our lives. That's what we should seek. Now, the psalmist goes on to say that when a person relates to God in that way, as a person seeks to know the Lord through the testimony of his word, that person's life is characterized in an encouraging way. Look further into verse 3. He says, he is like a tree planted by streams of water. Now, pause there. It's a tree planted by the source of life. In order for the tree to thrive, it has to have water. Water is the source of life. The psalmist is saying, when we move toward God through the testimony of his word, through the law, we reflect on it and we relate to him accordingly, we're discovering the source of life because God is willing to direct his life toward our lives. This reminds me of the words of Jesus in John 15 when he says, I am the vine and you are the branches. Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing. Well, the psalmist is saying that when we come to God in a relational way, we're like a tree planted by streams of water. We are next to the source of life. And he goes on then to say that yields fruit in its season. But as I relate to God on a personal level, he wants to direct his life toward me. I hope over the last 10 days you've been seeking to do that actively. You've been trying to position yourself to allow God to speak into your life through the reading of his word. And as we do that in faith, the promise is that we are going to be able to draw from God the life that he makes possible so that we can bear fruit. Now, it does say, however, fruit in its season. Some of you probably thought, well, I want to see the favor or the blessing or the activity of God immediately. I've been reading for a week now, and I'm really watching for something spectacular to happen. That's not what the psalmist describes. He says you will bear fruit in its season. I don't know what you're doing with your extra time, those of you that are spending more time at home. Last week, my wife went out and began to rework her garden, and she worked long hours to get the beds prepared and then to plant the seeds and the plants so that eventually we would have fruit. She knows, and I know, that just because she planted it one day doesn't mean in a matter of a couple of days we're going to enjoy the the fruit that ultimately the plants will supply? Well, I would simply remind us as we come to God day by day, as we seek to know him through his word, our expectation isn't in an overnight result that we're going to suddenly have this abundance of fruit in an instant. No, we know the fruit will come in its season. Look at it again in verse 3. He's like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season. And, note this, its leaf does not wither. That's the phrase that's especially encouraging to me. That as I relate to God for who he is through his word, I seek to know him, that what he promises to do is then to sustain me. That my life, my fruit, my leaf will not wither. He will ultimately provide what I need. The psalmist characterized it in another way when he goes on to say, in all that he does, he prospers. So that as I'm relating to God for who he is, the testimony is that God, in response, is going to provide what I need so that I might prosper. Now, maybe more than one of you is a little confused by that. Does that imply that as I relate to God actively in faith, I follow him, that then I never have disappointment? That I'm not adversely affected by the coronavirus? Well, obviously, that's not true. All of us are being affected by the coronavirus. So, what does it mean when the psalmist says, in all that he does, he prospers? The Hebrew word for prosper there, in some other context, can be translated advances. The idea is that God promises to bring us forward, that whatever's happening around us, like a tree planted by the source of life, he indeed will bring us through what we face. We will, in another way of saying it, prosper. Doesn't mean outward prosperity as Americans sometimes want to define it. It means that inward provision that assures us that we will reach that destination before us, that he will bring us through. Now, that's the testimony. And we should be encouraged by that. As a person of faith, I should be reassured that as day by day I turn my heart toward God, I relate to God, I read from his word, that the assurance is that God assumes responsibility to sustain me, to enable me to advance. Now, the psalmist does warn that those who choose the opposite path have an opposite outcome. He says that the wicked are not so. They are like chaff that the wind drives away. That, where God assures us a level of stability where he will bring us through the situations, those who reject him, they have no assurance. There is an instability to what their future will hold. And still further, in terms of eternity, there's actually a more serious warning. He says, therefore, verse 5, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. So as a person turns away from God, it not only introduces instability in their lives, as they reject God, the testimony of the psalmist is ultimately they will be held responsible by God. They will not share in the blessing in the future that God provides for those who relate to him. And so it's a serious word of warning. How does the psalm conclude? Well, verse 6, it writes, for the Lord, he says, knows the way of the righteous. Now, that phrase, once again, should encourage us. The verb to know there is a Hebrew word that really emphasizes a knowledge that's very personal. He knows your situation. He knows your struggles. He's aware of everything that we're facing in this present environment. He knows us as we're relating to him. In contrast, the way of the wicked, the psalmist then concludes, their way ends with disappointment, that they will perish. Now, there you have the opening psalm, and it's intended to point us toward an active relationship with God. We want to turn to Him through His Word so that He can establish us like a tree planted by the streams of water. I encourage you day by day to seek that, to chase after that by faith, just to turn your heart toward God and ask God to help you, to relate to you, to support you, to bring you through, that He would enable you to advance. That's Psalm 1. Now, maybe a few of you would say, well, again, that's encouraging, but it seems to be in conflict with everything that we see happening around us. In our life, week by week, seems to be more chaotic, and the threats and the dangers that confront us, does our present circumstances contradict what Psalm 1 teaches? By no means. As we've been reading Psalm 2, 3, 4, as we've read forward, we've realized that a person of faith still encounters disappointment. They still experience struggles. They still find their hearts at times afraid. Now, that's not an indication that God has abandoned them. It's rather, I guess, a reminder that this is the manner of life, that none of us are going to be immune from hardship or hurt. But what God promises as we relate to Him is that He will establish us like that tree so that we can move through these experiences as we are honest about what we're feeling and as we allow Him to give us the wisdom to navigate the challenges that we encounter. Now, let me just in another brief way point you to one other psalm before my time is over. This is going to be a psalm that you're going to be reading, I guess, this coming Saturday. Those of you that started with us 10 days ago, it's Psalm 13. And for me, it illustrates the very thing that I've been describing, how a person of faith may actually find himself or herself suddenly overwhelmed by a circumstance. That's not an indication that the assurances of God have fallen short. No, God's going to see us through. Now, Psalm 13 is written by David, and David experienced the highs and lows of the life of faith. We're going to read a number of David's Psalms into the weeks ahead. But I wanted just for a few moments to read Psalm 13 because some of you need to hear what David expresses to God, because you may realize that his words can become your words as you deal with your own struggles. Psalm 13 begins with a series of questions. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? If you wondered over the last couple of weeks in the midst of some of our circumstances, if God's forgotten you, that God's overlooking you, that God has somehow become blind to our circumstance, David becomes even more personal. He asks another question. How long will you hide your face from me? David was at such a difficult place. At least emotionally, it felt as if God was distant from him. Now, let me remind us all, just because we may feel emotionally distant doesn't mean that God has somehow removed himself. No, our emotions will rise and fall. In David's case, he just was feeling the weight of the circumstances around him, and he felt as if God was far off. And then he says in verse 2, how long must I take counsel in my soul and have sorrow in my heart all the day long? I appreciate David acknowledging that, when you find yourself in a position where it feels as if God is far off, your prayers sometimes feel as if you're just talking to yourself. You're taking counsel with yourself, that God's not there to advise or to guide. You feel so isolated. That's where David is. He says, it seems like all I'm doing is just talking to myself. And the sorrows of my heart, they just seem to grow and to increase with each passing day. He then acknowledges the challenge. He says, how long shall my enemy be exalted over me? He's looking at this battle and he feels like he's on the losing side of it, at least at this moment. That those that were opposing him seem to have the upper hand. Then he prays. Verse 3, consider and answer me. O Lord my God. See, he recognizes he's not where he emotionally wants to be, and he's honest in his expressing his bewilderment to God about the circumstances, but now he appeals to God. Just consider, the word consider means look at what's happening and answer me, O Lord my God. And then his petition, light up my eyes. Now that is a prayer that I've prayed on quite a few occasions. My wife is astute enough and perceptive enough to realize when I'm going through a struggle, sometimes she'll recognize that my eyes become dull, that the circumstances are affecting me negatively. And when I find myself in that state, the thing to do is to go to God and to admit that and to pray, God, would you bring life back to my eyes? Would you light up my eyes? That's David's prayer. And he expands the thought, lest I sleep the sleep of death. I mean, he felt himself sinking. He would say, light up my eyes, lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. That's an honest admission again on David's part. He is shaken, whatever the circumstance was. And yet his prayer is, God, would you so affect my heart so that it's seen in my eyes? Light up my eyes. He moves from the prayer, though, to express a commitment of purpose. Verses 5 and 6. But I, here's the testimony, have trusted in your steadfast love. I can't help but note, he doesn't say, but I have trusted in you. Now, he could express that, but in his bewilderment and in his discouragement, he's very focused on where he directs his trust. He says, no, I have trusted in your steadfast love. He's reminded himself of God's faithfulness, of God's commitment to bring him through. Again, going back to Psalm 1, to enable him to prosper, even in the midst of these difficulties, to advance. He says, I'm choosing to trust in your steadfast love. And then he says, my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. And not only that, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Now, look at the tenses in verses 5 and 6. In verse 5, his trust is past tense. It's something that he's already committed himself to do. Because of his commitment to trust, he moves into the present and future where he says, my heart will now rejoice. That's a determination to act on his trust. And not just rejoice, I'm going to sing. I'm going to sing to the Lord. And I think sometimes as we face some of our difficulties and we renew our faith, it's actually emotionally and spiritually therapeutic to sing to the Lord, to express in song emotion, to renew faith. Because, now notice that it's back to past tense, he has dealt bountifully with me. That's the testimony. As David looks at his circumstance, his mindset is now that the provision is already there. Even though experientially he's still moving toward the provision, in his heart, his faith is so embraced the provision, he knows that he can sing to the Lord. I can't tell you the number of times that Psalm 13 has helped me through some of the difficulties, the disappointments, the experiences that have just discouraged my heart. I've allowed David's words to give voice to my emotions. Maybe there's one or two of you, even tonight, that would be encouraged by allowing David to lead you toward God's steadfast love in a personal way. Well, here we've talked about a couple of Psalms. I want to allow for a moment or two to look at maybe some of the questions that we have. My wife was going to perhaps help me as we would look at those that have posted some potential questions. Now, maybe you haven't, and that's all right too. But if you have, I do want to give you a moment of time where I can try. I'm glancing at our list. Okay. All right. I don't see a direct question. I would say in our NFWBC group, we have every single day opportunities for you to comment on your readings in the book of Acts or your readings in the Psalms. And some in that setting have submitted questions. And I've tried. Now, it sometimes takes a few hours for me to see the questions that they have been submitted. But I've tried to respond to those questions in a way that hopefully has provided some added insight. In closing, let me remind you of our appeal on Sunday. Of course, we learned from the Jesus story of the Good Samaritan that we want to elevate our standard of love. And if you recall, I urged you to try to express some level of support, perhaps to your neighbors across the street, on the right or left of you. If you've not already done that, again, I'm not asking you to disregard any of the guidelines that the president has requested of us, but if you are physically able to do that, extend the love of God by just offering your help. Or, as I promoted on Sunday, why not also take your phone and just begin to call some people? Make an effort every single day going through the week, maybe to call 2 or 3 people just to say, hey, I was thinking about you, wanted to check on you. And you never know how much of a support that may be for a person just to have somebody giving them a call. Then finally, I encouraged us all to begin to pray for some of the individuals we know that are facing some difficulties and to pray for them by name. And once you pray for them, once again, take out your phone and text them. And as you text them, you're just reminding them that someone is lifting them to the Lord in prayer. And you're seeking just to be one that is coming alongside of them in whatever the struggle that they're currently facing. So this is something that all of us can do, whether you've done it thus far this week. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I just want us, as we move into the remainder of this week, to elevate the standard of love in a way that God can touch a life through you. Thank you for being with us for our opening session of our study in the Psalms. I hope it will be something you'll choose to continue to be a part of as we move into the weeks ahead. And again, I'm going to try to get more comfortable with this format. It's just a different world to try to interact in these ways. But thank you I see a number of folks who've joined us. I'm blessed that you've chosen to be a part of this inaugural time. And thank you for giving me a little bit of your Wednesday evening tonight. Let me dismiss, if I may, with a prayer, just to ask the Lord's blessing on us all as we move into the night. Father, I'm thankful for each person that's participated with us this evening, and for those who be watching this broadcast perhaps even at another time. And I pray that we could learn from the Psalms those lessons that will move us forward in faith, that will allow the testimonies of the psalm writers in some way to give voice to our own emotions, in some way to move our faith forward through our disappointments, through our fears, to remind us consistently of the goodness of the God who loves us. So Lord, just help us day by day to open your word, to relate to you as Psalm 1 describes, where we just reflect on what you say and you establish us in ways where we experience more of your life. So Father, I pray your blessing on all who are participating. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, before I sign off, I'm going to give you one final opportunity. If there was, my wife has informed me there is a question.
Just wondering if you would consider continuing the armor of God in this form.
The question was asked just before all of the changes due to the coronavirus. We had begun a brand new series on Wednesdays on the armor of God. And to answer the question, yes, I would be open to that. I'm not sure yet in the time frame of things when that might be introduced. I wanted, though, at least in this format, to, as you're reading in the Psalms, to give you an opportunity to stay connected with that. So let me take that to thought and consider some other options as we look ahead. And indeed, maybe, now, God forbid that our limitations are going to stretch too terribly long, so that if after we're able to resume gathering, perhaps at that point we'll be able to jump quickly into the study of the armor of God. But thank you for that question. Once more, thank you for being a part, and may the Lord bless you, encourage you, and remind you of his presence as we face all of what is in front of us these days. Have a great evening.